Welcome to CounterPunch Radio. I am your program producer, Nathaniel St. Clair, and I just wanted to slide in before today's interview and give you a taste of the paid portion of our website, and remind you that becoming a CP Plus member is the best way to support our publication. What you will find there is not bonus content. It is first-rate, hard-hitting investigative journalism. For example, this vivid piece by Peter Bach titled The Soul of Detroit, 1985. Here's a snippet. "This is no place to be cavalier," he began, throwing me by speaking so ornately and slowly. "There has been a white flight," he said, sinisterly over-enunciating. "A white flight," he repeated. Oddly, for someone made indignant by their meaning, he loved those three words. Do you know what a white flight is? I said I didn't, but could guess. "That's when white folk leave a place," he said. "I mean, leave real fast. This place," he said, "checked out long ago." End quote. That is just one of many evocative articles you will have access to as a member of CP Plus, which is only $5 a month. That is a lot of organic journalism for less than a carton of organic large eggs at Whole Foods. Anyway, let's get to what you came here for. Our interview with the brilliant M.V. Ramana.
Welcome to CounterPunch Radio. This is Joshua Frank, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Erik Wallenberg, and we have a wonderful guest in the house, M.V. Ramana, and Erik is going to introduce Ramana, and we're going to jump right in.
All right, great, Josh. Thanks a lot. We're very excited to be able to bring M.V. Ramana onto the show. Ramana is the Simons Chair in Disarmament, Global and Human Security, and professor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. He's the author of The Power of Promise, Examining Nuclear Energy in India, and co-editor of Prisoners of the Nuclear Dream. Ramana is a member of the International Panel on Fissile Materials, the Canadian Pugwash Group, the International Nuclear Risk Assessment Group, and the team that produces the annual World Nuclear Industry Status Report. He's the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Leo Szilard Award from the American Physical Society. You are well versed in these questions, and it's the kind of expertise that we desperately need to take on this question of nuclear power in this moment. So we're really excited to have you with us. I should add that Ramana is most recently the author of Nuclear is Not the Solution, The Folly of Atomic Power in the Age of Climate Change, just out from Verso Books. And this book, I think, is so exciting. So we're excited to have you here to talk about it today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's my honor to be on this show. And it's also a real pleasure because I've heard many of your shows in the past. And so it's really a pleasure to be part of this conversation.
Thanks so much. Ramana, we know that June was the hottest on record. July, the temperatures were scorching. They're saying that it was the hottest July in over 120,000 years. We know that fossil fuels in capitalism and humans are driving this crisis, and we need answers, right? We need them fast. But there seems to be this new call for atomic power. It's been heralded by many people, from Bill Gates to those of us, some of us on the left, as an answer that we've been waiting for and looking for. We'll get into a lot of these arguments, but let's start out with safety of nuclear power, which is how you open your book. Advocates today are saying that atomic power is a lot safer than it was in the past, that we don't need to worry about these accidents. Designs are different. There's not going to be another Chernobyl or Fukushima. Not to mention that they argue these accidents in the past are overblown. But you argue that this is simply not the case, that we should be very cautious. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, it's a great question to open the conversation with, because a lot of the propaganda or advocacy for nuclear energy is based on imaginary nuclear reactor designs. These are, perfect reactors that can never have a serious accident, that can be built very fast, can be built cheap, and so on and so forth, none of which has been ever shown to happen in the real world. But there are a number of reasons, I will talk specifically about safety. There are a number of reasons why it's impossible to be confident that any nuclear reactor is safe. A nuclear reactor ultimately is just a very complicated way to boil water. That's what it is. And it's using a very hazardous process, the process of nuclear fission, whereby a heavy uranium nucleus or a plutonium nucleus divides up into two lighter elements, the so-called fission products. These are typically radioactive elements. And these radioactive elements are hazardous to human health because when these radioactive materials decay, they are producing alpha, beta, or gamma rays. And these things, if they enter the body, they can damage the DNA, which can then lead to cancers and a whole range of other health impacts. And so the purpose of the nuclear reactor, or designing a nuclear reactor, is to make sure that none of these materials can ever escape out into the biosphere. And that requires a lot of complicated engineering, a lot of safety features, thick, steel and concrete walls and things of that sort. Now, because you have all of these different safety systems, and because of the nature of the process, the technology is inherently a very complex technology. As you can imagine, a nuclear reactor is not, it's like rocket science, if you like. So it's not going to be a simple process. But also, one of the central insights that the sociologist called Charles Perrow came up with when he examined the 1979 Three Mile Island accident. And he extended that analysis to a whole bunch of other hazardous technologies. What he found was that many of these technologies, which seem to be suffering accidents, which are inexplicable, at least in foresight. One of the common features is that these are what he called interactive complexity, that there are different parts of the system which interact with each other to lead to potential end states of the system or configurations of the system which have not been envisioned in advance. And if you are going to deal with a system where you don't know what is going to happen, then it's impossible to design safety features to prevent those things from happening. The other important thing that Perrow observed was that these reactors have what he called tight coupling. In other words, events happen in very quick succession. And if something goes wrong, you don't have time to make amends for that, or the time that is available for you is very, very limited, right? And these, he found, were sort of generic features to large numbers of technologies, but nuclear power epitomized those particular features, nuclear reactors. And regardless of your kind of nuclear reactor, all of them are going to share these features, some element of this. So it is true that some kinds of reactors cannot suffer the kinds of accidents we've seen in the past. So if you have a nuclear reactor that does not use water for cooling, then you don't have to worry about certain kinds of accidents involving a pipe breaking or something like that. But there could be other accident scenarios, and there are other accident scenarios in these other designs, which still will lead to radioactive elements escaping from the reactor. So if you think about the reactor design that Bill Gates is promoting, the so-called sodium-cooled fast reactor, the natrium reactor design, sodium is a very difficult material to work with. It's chemically, it reinteracts very strongly with water and air, and these are the most abundant elements everywhere. And so you have to be taking a lot of care to make sure the sodium never escapes. But there are inherent chemical properties that make sodium always, the materials that are surrounding the sodium start interacting with the sodium leading to leakages, things of that sort. And more important, these kind of fast reactors have a particular kind of reactor accident possibility scenario, which is called a core disassembly accident, wherein there is a feedback loop that drives more and more reactivity, more and more energy production, to the point where no amount of containment, no amount of safety features around the reactor can actually hold back the energy that is produced, right? And so there are scenarios in these kinds of, the point is not to get into each of these particular accidents, but the point is to say in any reactor design, there will be potential accident scenarios. They're all low probability. Does not mean that accidents are going to happen every day, but it's never going to be zero, right? The probability of an accident. And so anybody who's contemplating setting up a reactor has to contend with the fact that one bad day, one of these reactors could have one of these accidents. And the people who live near there, like the people who near Pripyat in Chernobyl or Fukushima prefecture, have to leave their homes, go away and probably never come back because these are contaminated with radioactive elements like cesium and iodine and so on.
Great, thanks for that. Could you say a little bit more about Fukushima, actually, just where things stand there? I think it's worth, it sort of falls out of the news, right? People don't think about it, they don't talk about it. It was this big disaster, and then it was like, oh, apparently everything's fine, people moved on, right? So hoping you might say just a little bit about that to give people a sense of the long-term crisis that a nuclear meltdown would have.
Yeah. So Fukushima was one of those accidents where things which were not expected to happen happened. The expectation was that you have multiple safety systems in any reactor design, including the Fukushima design, and one of those systems will make sure that the reactor stays safe. What happened in Fukushima was that was something interesting, which is that there was an earthquake first, which led to the reactor being shut down. So the reactor stopped producing electricity, but the radioactive fuel elements inside the reactor, those continue to be radioactive, those continue to be decaying and producing heat. And in any reactor, this is the case. Even if a reactor is shut down for routine maintenance, the radioactive spent fuel inside the reactor is going to be decaying. And you have to keep extracting out the heat in some fashion. That became a challenge in Fukushima after the tsunami occurred. So in any reactor, the way that the heat is typically removed is by electricity coming from the outside, from the grid that is powering various pumps that are pushing in water and taking out the water. And in Fukushima, when the earthquake occurred, that outside source of electricity was cut off. And then the system sort of shifted to using diesel generators, which were on site, which kicked in the moment the power failed. This is the safety system for when there is one failure. But then the tsunami basically flooded those basements where these diesel generators were kept. And then the diesel generator stopped working. There was no way to send out water through the system to cool the spent fuel. So things started heating up, and eventually the water inside the reactor got converted into steam. Then the zirconium cladding, which is actually a safety system around the fuel elements, started interacting with the steam to produce hydrogen. The hydrogen eventually exploded, and that led to radioactivity escaping out of the reactor. Now, we were very lucky for a couple of reasons, or the people of Japan, I would say. One was that for most of the time when the radioactive materials were coming out, the wind was actually blowing towards the Pacific Ocean rather than inland. So a lot of the radioactive contaminants actually went over the Pacific Ocean. Now, of course, some of the fish there and the other marine life probably got contaminated. I don't know if any studies that have been done to the health of the fish, whether anybody has sort of looked at that. To my knowledge, nobody has looked at it. People have looked at flora and fauna on the land to some extent in the case of Fukushima, and extensively in the case of Chernobyl, to document that those also suffer health impacts. But back to Fukushima, so there was a whole set of areas that had to be evacuated because of the expectation that the radiation dose to people who are there would be too high, and they would have noticeable health impacts, including cancer and other kinds of impacts. The second element of luck that happened was there was a lot more radioactive material that was sitting inside a spent fuel pool. So once the fuel is loaded into the reactor, there's a period after which it ceases to be effective in producing these nuclear fission reactions. So at that point, it is removed from the reactor and stored on large pools, like swimming pools, of purified water, so that the heat that is being produced from the radioactive decays, as well as the gamma rays and other rays that are coming out, are absorbed by the water. So the people are not exposed to it. So there was one of these pools in one of the reactors, and that started leaking out water. But very fortuitously, there was other water coming from a different system, which wasn't expected to go in, but it was managing to top up the spent fuel pool. Had that other accident, there's sort of two fortuitous, one accident and another fortuitous accident, which allowed this pool to stay, the spent fuel to stay submerged. Had it ever gone unsubmerged, then there could have been a fire that released a lot more radioactivity. And Japanese nuclear experts had also modeled that scenario, and they had communicated this to the Japanese Prime Minister at that time, Naoto Kan, and had told him that in the event that a fire breaks out from this, they might have to evacuate Tokyo. And this was Naoto Kan's sort of nightmare scenario. Imagine having to evacuate a city with such a large population as Tokyo, right? So that is the scenario. Now, subsequently, what's happened, the reactor, I don't want to give you a full update on what's happening. There's a lot of post-accident activities that are happening. But the short version of that is there's a huge amount of radioactive waste, which has been collected on the site. And in particular, there is this one kind of waste, which is tritiated water. This has to do with the exact location of the site and the fact that there's a lot of underground water that goes through the system, collects all these radioactive materials, and then comes out. And you don't want it to contaminate the water, the aquifers and the groundwater. So you're collecting that. They're collecting those water, and they try to purify it. But there's one element which they cannot purify out, which is tritium, which is a radioactive isotope of hydrogen. Tritiated water has exactly the same chemical properties as regular water, so there's no way to remove it. And the volume is so large that now Japan is sort of putting it out into the sea, into the Pacific Ocean. So that's one thing that's happening. And then there's been a huge amount of decontamination of the lands near Fukushima, primarily because the successive Japanese LDP governments, in particular under Shinzo Abe, were very particular on trying to create the impression that Fukushima's accident is long far past, we have moved on, and they try to hold the Olympics there, the torch run there, etc. So it's all a sort of, you want to portray a certain image of Japan, and this is all in service of that. So people have been asked to move back, and some people do move back either because they feel nostalgic for the area where they lived for a long time, or because the government said, we're going to stop giving you subsidies for living elsewhere. And so some of them have moved back. Others have said, no, we're not going to move back. Many of the people who have moved back find these communities to be kind of deserted. Nobody's setting up shops. People don't have, if you have young children, you don't have schools which have enough students to actually have a reasonable, meaningful education experience, etc., etc. So life for those people is never going to be the same as it was before the accident. So in that sense, the accident is still continuing, or the impacts of the accident are still continuing for all of these people.
I think this is a good place to talk about waste. Obviously, there's still waste in Fukushima. I live a short distance from San Onofre in Southern California, where there's 3.6 million gallons of high-level radioactive waste sitting on this this cliff by the Pacific Ocean in a seismically active area, not unlike Fukushima, really. Just last week, they released 120,000 gallons of effluent into the Pacific Ocean. To me, that danger seems imminent, but to a lot of people, they seem not to be aware of it. Of course, like Japan, the U.S. Department of Energy doesn't talk about these risks, but we have a problem here, right? We don't have a permanent, safe repository for this high-level waste. Why is that? And is this a problem that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, so I'd sort of back up a little bit to say that you mentioned the word safe repository. And I want to sort of pick on that particular point, because that's the quote unquote solution that is being sold to the public as the way to deal with waste. Now, what is a repository? In simple terms, basically what it is, it's a deep hole somewhere in the ground where they're going to bury all the waste and then hope and pray that the waste radioactive materials never come back into the biosphere. That's ultimately what a repository is, right? The challenge with, and people have been talking about repositories, in a way, it's an admission that you cannot do anything serious about the radioactive waste. You cannot make the waste go away, the radioactivity go away, because radioactivity is a natural property of the elements that are being created. And I want to sort of remind people, listeners, that these are elements, we are talking about cesium or iodine or any of these different materials. These are not things that have actually existed in the earth before 1945, before the nuclear thing. So these are brand new wastes, hazardous wastes that are being produced. In a sense, this is very different from the other kinds of waste we are talking about in terms of, let's say, solar panels or something of that sort. Those also produce waste, but those are basically waste that are produced from things that are already on the earth. The nuclear fuel cycle is the one thing that produces new hazardous wastes, right? And the fact that these are going to be staying radioactive for as long as they are radioactive suggests that you have to deal with it in a way that is, bounded by the laws of physics, right? And so the only solution they have managed to find is to dig a hole and bury it there. That's theoretically, that's the solution that they have come up with. There are people who will talk sometimes about we can transmute this, like put this into an environment where they are being bombarded with neutrons and other things like that, to try and convert these radioactive materials into other radioactive materials, hopefully with shorter half-lives and things of that sort. But people have quickly realized, or have over the decades realized, that those solutions are impractical, both for the volume of the materials that you have to deal with and the number of times you have to put them through these neutron bombardment and so on, and the high cost, right? If you're going to be spending so much money just dealing with the waste, then nuclear energy, which is already very expensive, becomes prohibitively expensive. Okay, now coming back to the question of the repository. The challenge is that what we are trying to do is to make sure that these materials stay underground and not contaminate the groundwater or come up to the surface in some fashion for the hundreds of thousands of years that these are going to be radioactive, right? We just don't have that kind of knowledge. We don't, geology, to the extent that we know how the earth sort of behaves, is a historical science. It's not a predictive science. There are all the times we see earthquakes happen in areas where they were not expected to happen. There's never been a history of earthquakes. An example is, to my knowledge, the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand that happened some years ago, about a decade ago, was in an area where there had never been earthquakes before. So this is a brand new site, if you like. And then there are a whole bunch of sites where we know there are seismic faults and so on and so forth, right? And even there, we don't know when an earthquake is going to happen. Likewise, we don't know when a particular area there may be a volcanic eruption, things of that sort. Plus, you have a different problem. To the extent that we know geology, we can say that, okay, there are these areas where the geology has stayed more or less stable for hundreds of thousands of years from what we know. But those sites are not sites which have been disturbed by human beings. The moment you dig a repository, you're already disturbing the geology there, right? You dug a hole there. So the rock is no longer the way it was before, right? When you're digging that hole, there's going to be all kinds of changes to the rock. And we have climate change coming in, which might change a whole set of factors. So there's a lot of uncertainties. This is not to say that the people who are trying to design these repositories don't do their very best to try and predict and try to make sure that this is as safe a site as possible. But there's limits to what we can know. And you have to sort of admit with some humility that we cannot predict what is going to happen so far in the future. We also cannot predict how people or future generations of people will behave, right? How do we communicate to people who are living in, let us say, the 31st century, that you have had a repository here with some kinds of, radioactive materials, right? Or, some much further in the future. Our oldest written records are about 5,000 years old, right? We don't really know how to communicate with this. You can kind of come up with fancy propositions, but I don't think you can ever validate those things, right? So the point is whether you can demonstrate safety, whether you can be confident of safety, or you can say, look, we produce these materials and we'll do the best we can. And that's about it. But we cannot give you any assurance of safety. The last thing I want to say is that we also have some experiences of people setting up repositories, though not for waste from nuclear power plants. So there were a couple of experiments in Germany, and then there was one in the United States. That's probably the best studied one, is the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. So this is meant to store certain kinds of waste from the nuclear weapons production in the United States. So it's not part of the energy program, it's part of the weapons program. In the case of the WIP site, the waste isolation pilot plant, the plant was sort of, the site was supposed to be safe for hundreds of thousands of years, or however long it takes to sort of deal with the plutonium and other radioactive materials from the nuclear waste, from the nuclear weapons program. But this repository, there was an explosion involving some of these barrels or cans of plutonium waste that was stored in certain kinds of materials that were meant to absorb various things that were being emanated, and there was an explosion. Right? I don't want to get into all the details of that, but these things exploded within 15 years of setting up the plant. And that was completely unanticipated by the designers, right? They now can trace back what was the error. Somebody changed the kind of chemical composition of the materials. They thought they were doing a good thing because they were using an organic material instead of an inorganic material, but they hadn't foreseen certain kinds of chemical reactions. Now, the question is, what else have you not foreseen, right? And we will never know that. So all of this basically means that we can never be confident. So what do you do in such a situation? When you find yourself in a hole, you stop digging. And in this context, that means you stop producing more nuclear waste. And then we can have a conversation about what's the best we can do with this. But the nuclear industry is not willing to have that conversation because they see that a lot of people are opposed to nuclear power, partly because they're concerned about these radioactive waste. And they want to be able to pretend and say, oh, we have the solution. This problem is no longer a problem. You can forget all about it, right? And please let us build more nuclear reactors, because that's the way their business is going to go forward. But I don't think as members of the public, we should be agreeing or we should be accepting their assurance of safety.
And this isn't even to talk about the transportation issue, right? If we were to roll out hundreds of plants all over the country, and let's just say Yucca Mountain is chosen as a repository, I don't know, you put this waste on trucks and on trains. And as we know, it seems like every 6 months there's a new derailment with an oil tanker or something. But in this case, it would be high level radioactive waste. I mean, the problems seem to be endless.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And again, if there's a process going on in Canada where they are trying to find a location for a repository. And they have found there are 2 places in Ontario which have been on the shortlist. Now, what is interesting here is that there's a lot of local politics which I don't want to get into, but there's some pretense that they are trying to find a willing site or a site that there's some consent from those sites. They don't ever ask communities which are going to be along the transportation routes, right? They have not been asked whether you're willing to have these things go. And in fact, they will probably say, we are not going to tell you which communities, where the transportation routes are going to go, because we are afraid that, this is sensitive information. There may be a terrorist attack and stuff like that. But if you're really concerned about terrorist attacks, then obviously it means you're not confident about the safety. If you're transporting, let us say, wheat, you're not going to be concerned about revealing the transportation route, right?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think I want to also now shift us a little bit to thinking about where they're more overt about their want to use nuclear. So yesterday in us doing this interview, marks the 79 years since the US dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The horrific bombing of civilians on such a massive scale has only ever been carried out by the US on that day, and then of course 3 days later in Nagasaki. One thing that proponents of nuclear power like to downplay is its link to nuclear weapons and the military. But you argue that the separation between the two, both scientifically and politically, is less absolute than they'd have us believe. And if you'll allow me, I do just want to quote and open at the opening couple of pages of your book. You write, although climate change scares me, I'm even more scared of a future with more nuclear plants. Increasing how much energy is produced with nuclear reactors would greatly exacerbate the risks of severe accidents like the one at Chernobyl, expand how much of our environment is contaminated with radioactive waste that remain hazardous for millennia, and last but not least, make catastrophic nuclear war more likely. And so I was hoping you might just say some more about this as we think about the transportation of nuclear waste, but also this question of nuclear war, and that we're willingly creating more and more nuclear weapons. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is a particularly opportune moment to be talking about this, or in a unfortunately opportune moment to be talking about it, both because of the anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also because we are seeing around the world an increased emphasis on expanding nuclear arsenals, possibly restarting nuclear weapons testing. Donald Trump has said that, his advisors have told him the US should resume nuclear weapons testing. There's a new kind of, ICBM under development, the Sentinel missile, which is already hugely over budget and so on. And yet Congress has kind of said, we need to do this. So there should be concern about nuclear weapons. And also given the fact that we seem to be on the verge of a lot of great power wars. We're seeing what's happening in Ukraine and, in the horrific onslaught on Gaza, right? And this is the kind of world we live in. And if nuclear weapons were to be used in any of these things, the effects will be obviously even more catastrophic than it already is. Now, what is the linkage between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons? So I would say there are, in the book, I kind of talk about 3 elements, but in actual fact, I'm actually talking about 5 different elements, right? The first is actually a very obvious overlap. So if you think about the nuclear power plants around the world, they are in about 30 odd countries, 31 or 32, if I remember right. I don't remember the exact number. And there are roughly about 415 reactors when I last checked around the world. Of these 415 reactors, around 280 of those reactors are in countries with nuclear weapons. United States, France, China, UK, Russia, India, Pakistan, okay? There are only 2 countries which have nuclear weapons, which don't have nuclear power plants, that is Israel and North Korea. Of course, Israel doesn't officially have nuclear weapons. It's the world's sort of best known secret, or whatever, it's open secret. Anyway, so there's a clear overlap. And if you include all of the countries that are militarily allied through NATO, then that number is going to probably become close to 370 or something of that sort, of the order of, it's a vast majority of countries either have their own nuclear weapons or are allied with a nuclear weapon country, right? So there is a kind of obvious geographical overlap. The other overlap is the overlap of history, right? The nuclear reactors were first built in order to produce plutonium to build a bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki and was tested at the Trinity site in New Mexico. And then subsequently, all the other countries have built nuclear power reactors first to produce material for nuclear weapons. But there's also the reverse thing which happens, which is that when you build a nuclear power program, you gain the technical capability to become closer to the ability to having the capacity to make nuclear weapons, right? This is because all reactors are fueled by uranium. Most of them are fueled by enriched uranium. And the process of enriching uranium, which is where you try to increase the fraction of uranium-235 isotopes in the uranium, is the same process whether you're going to enrich it for fueling a nuclear reactor or to make a nuclear weapon. You just have to keep running the process forward to make it more and more concentrated in the uranium-235 element to make it into a nuclear weapon. This is why there is this public concern about Iran's nuclear program, right? Iran has a uranium enrichment program. They say it is for peaceful purposes. They want to design a research reactor. And that might well be true. We don't really know because I have not been inside this. I don't know. I've not been inside the heads of these people to know what their ultimate intent is. But it is not something which many other countries believe in. There are some countries which are, reasons to want to believe that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, like Israel, so that it has an excuse to go and beat up on Iran. But then there are other people who might be genuinely saying, look, we cannot know. And that's actually true. The technical capability to enrich uranium also gives them the technical capability to enrich it to the point where it can be used to make nuclear weapons. And then it becomes a matter of intent, not capacity. The other common element is what I mentioned earlier, which is that all reactors produce plutonium. Plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb and the Trinity test was produced in the first reactors that were built in Hanford in Washington state, right? And likewise in many of the other countries. In India, for example, they got a reactor from Canada, the Canada-India reactor, for which the United States supplied heavy water, and that was the source of the plutonium that India tested in 1974. So there's a lot of technical overlap between these two things. Again, in the case of the plutonium, all that the country requires to do is to use the chemical process, which is called reprocessing, to extract out the plutonium from the spent fuel, where it is surrounded by a lot of highly radioactive materials, to take out the plutonium to use in the nuclear weapon. And the nuclear energy advocates also, like India, they would say we want to be able to extract the plutonium not to make nuclear weapons, but to fuel other nuclear reactors, the so-called fast breeder reactors, right? So there's an excuse to actually do reprocessing. And in India and Canada, where I live, there's a company called Moltex, which is proposing to do exactly this kind of reprocessing using a sort of method called pyroprocessing. Again, that will make the spent fuel, the plutonium from the spent fuel, much more available for using in nuclear weapons. So there's that technical capacity. The two other things which I want to say is that when you want to set up a nuclear power program, you have to train a bunch of people to do the designing of the reactors, to operate the reactors, and so on. Some of those training can be used also in a nuclear weapons program. The two are not identical. You have to do certain other things to make a nuclear weapon, but making the fissile material is one of the hardest parts. And you learn how to handle all these materials and train a bunch of people in nuclear physics and all kinds of other science and engineering fields that can be used to make nuclear weapons. And this is something which we see from the example of Pakistan. When Pakistan wanted to set up a nuclear energy program way back in the 1950s, they discovered they really didn't have enough people with training. And it was the US Atoms for Peace program announced by President Eisenhower that allowed Pakistani scientists and engineers to come to the United States, be trained in nuclear technology, go back, and some of them eventually went on to starting the nuclear weapons program. The same thing is true with Iran. Iran under the Shah wanted to build up a nuclear energy program. They actually had the money. They actually gave MIT a bunch of money to train a bunch of Iranian students. Some of them, once, of course, the revolution happened in Iran, all that was cut off. But these people had already been trained. So then they went back and eventually built up a nuclear program, which may or may not be a nuclear weapons program, but it can actually certainly give the capacity to do that. And the last thing which I want to mention, connection, is an institutional one. In many countries, the institution that is responsible for promoting nuclear energy is also the institution that also oversees the nuclear weapons program. So in the United States, that's the Department of Energy. And in India, the Department of Atomic Energy, which originally was set up only to do atomic energy for peaceful purposes. But eventually, it realized that actually it can get a lot of political power by developing nuclear weapons. And so it did that. And then ever since then, they've been rewarded with unstoppable budgets, if you like. So there are all these different connections, which make it almost the connection between nuclear energy and nuclear weapons a kind of inextricable one. As long as there is expansion of nuclear energy into a new country, so Saudi Arabia wants to build up a nuclear energy program, it is going to become that much closer to be able to develop nuclear weapons, right? It's not inevitable. It's a matter of choice. But it does have the capacity to do that.
Well, and right on the issue of reprocessing, if I'm not mistaken, it became or ended here in the United States under the Carter administration. But who's to say that wouldn't change under a Trump administration or maybe even a Harris administration? So it's very dependent on the politics of the country.
Absolutely. And in fact, it changed right after the Carter administration. The Reagan administration came back in and said, we are going to undo this measure. But what saved the day, so to say, is the Reagan administration's belief that the market has to decide. So they said, we are not going to subsidize this process. And then all private parties basically said, no, we are not going to develop this thing. But you're very right. I mean, the Biden administration has given funding for trying to demonstrate reprocessing on a small scale and things of that sort. So they are very much, it's back in the cards, unfortunately.
And it also seems to be back in the cards of this, idea that these new plants are an answer to climate change, right? It just recently, the Advance Act was this big bipartisan bill that was signed by Biden that made it much easier for plants in the U.S. to be licensed. And it seems like there's a huge lobbying effort behind this. Can you talk a little bit about some of the players in here in the United States and maybe elsewhere that are pushing this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's always been lobbying for nuclear energy, and I've sort of documented a lot of that in the history in my book. But there's a big increase in the lobbying effort around a decade ago. And the particular reason, was that till about a decade ago, we didn't really talk much about the economics of nuclear power, but it won't come as a surprise to most people that nuclear power plants are very expensive. And so they produce expensive electricity. What used to be the argument in the past was, we know a nuclear plant is expensive to build, but once you build it, it's cheap to operate because you don't need a lot of uranium. And in a coal plant, for example, most of the cost of electricity is actually the cost of the coal. But in a nuclear reactor, because uranium is so energy dense, we don't need a lot of fuel. And therefore, the operating cost, the marginal cost of producing power at a nuclear power plant used to be small. That argument became unstuck about a decade ago. Why? Because of the tremendous increase in the amount of renewables and the decline in cost of renewables. And renewables have essentially a zero marginal cost. Once you put up a wind turbine or a solar panel, you don't have to spend any extra money buying fuel for it, and the maintenance is fairly limited. So in principle, the owner of a plant can sell the electricity for essentially for free and still make a profit, right? And the way that electricity markets are set up, these are based on who can bid the lowest cost. Anyway, so this is the electricity scenario. And this was and the other important element is the growth of hydraulic fracturing or fracking, which made natural gas very cheap. And so natural gas plants also started having very low marginal costs. In this situation, a lot of utility companies that owned nuclear plants found themselves losing money. And so a bunch of plants got shut down, starting with, Vermont Yankee and things like that. In some cases, they would have some major repair that would happen because these reactors are old, and some piece of equipment that requires hundreds of millions of dollars to replace will go out of order. Then these guys say, this is our chance. We're just going to shut it down, right? We're not going to make any money on this plant anyway, and we don't want to spend this extra money replacing this equipment. So once these reactors started shutting down, the nuclear industry really got shit scared, and they really pulled out all the stops, and they got a bunch of subsidies from 5 states, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and I'm forgetting one more. Anyway, so there are a bunch of states that subsidize them. And then subsequently, under the Biden administration, we have this huge sort of, basically Santa Claus coming to town with a bag of goodies. And the players here involved, a bunch of different elements. So there is the so-called Nuclear Energy Institute, which is the main organization that goes and lobbies for nuclear power in the country. And this is funded by all of the utilities that have nuclear power plants, as well as, I assume, many of the companies that design nuclear power plants like Westinghouse and so on. These are presumably the people who are funding the Nuclear Energy Institute, which then goes on to lobbying in Congress, putting on various kinds of shows, and have been quite successful at it. The other thing they have been very involved in trying to lobby for is for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to weaken their regulations. And, in their annual reports, they actually talk about how successful they have been in lowering the budget of the NRC, right? Because then it makes the NRC much harder for them to be able to do all this stuff. So there's that whole element. The other thing which they did was a certain kind of a strategy, which was in many of these plants, what they would say is, there's a plant in, let's say, New York State, in a remote, in near Rochester or something of that sort. They would say, okay, we have this plant can generate 1,000 megawatts, and we're going to shut it down next year because we are losing money on this project. And at that point, 2 things happen. One is the electricity suppliers then have to worry about how are we going to make up this huge shortfall. Without any kind of planning process. If you were to say, look, I'm going to shut this down in 10 years, you can plan for that. And that actually New York did in the case of the Indian Point reactors. But in the other reactors, these utilities chose the strategy of saying, we're going to shut it down next year. So it becomes impossible to plan in such a short term. And the second thing that happens is that all the people who are working in the plant get told, you're going to be out of a job. And so then the local township, the local politicians, start lobbying in Albany, in Washington, saying you need to subsidize these plants because we don't want to lose all these people. These people shouldn't be losing their jobs. And that becomes another argument that they use, right? And I'll just say one last thing. This is also the argument about jobs is also one thing that comes up a lot when it comes to new nuclear reactors. And I think it's a very misleading argument for 2 reasons. One is, any kind of investment is going to create jobs, right? So when you put in billions of dollars, of course you're going to create jobs. But that doesn't matter whether you're making butter or whether you're making nuclear reactor, right? That's one thing to remember. The second is, the relevant question is, what is the number of jobs you're going to create per dollar invested, or per $1 billion invested? And nuclear is going to fare very, very low because historically speaking, we know that nuclear plants studies have shown that the number of jobs created per megawatt of capacity is very low, and nuclear plants are very expensive. So you're going to be spending a lot of money to create a few jobs, right? Now, from the left's perspective, that's actually a little bit of a complication. And I'll sort of mention this, even though I think that's, it's something which we have to discuss. These well-paid jobs tend to be very well protected. They are unionized. They want to preserve that. And basically what that is happening is you're putting in one sector of the working class against another sector of the working class, because the same money, if it is invested in solar panels, is going to create lots of jobs for a whole bunch of people who may not be earning the $150,000 that you get by working in a nuclear plant. They may be earning only $40,000, $50,000. And the question is, what do you do? Which section of the working class do you sort of support, right? And that's something which I think we have to be conversing about on the left, about how do we deal with this strategy. And I think the answer to that is we need to unionize people who are working in the renewable energy field, rather than saying, oh, these people are already unionized, so they're the only people we should be supporting.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you raise that question. I think we need a much more critical discussion on the left around what energy sector jobs look like, what we're supporting, that it's not all, it doesn't matter, it doesn't mean just because you're in a unionized job that means you're automatically on the side of this question of how do we move forward on climate change. There's really complicated issues there to be dealt with, and I think that's a fruitful area for future discussion. I hope we'll take that up in the podcast too, and maybe we'll have you back on for that too. I was hoping we might turn to just where you end the book. Your final chapter is called Magical Thinking and Billionaire Messiahs, New Technology as Solution. Of course, you talk about people like Bill Gates who support this kind of nuclear as a solution to climate change. I'm hoping you might just tell us a little bit about why that is and walk us through a few of those arguments. But I'm really interested, and I hope you'll say something about this, is why so many on the left and even the mainstream liberal establishment have fallen for this argument. You have, Oliver Stone's documentary on hailing nuclear power as a solution to climate change. You have the writers at Jacobin magazine, again and again and again with articles and editorials in support of nuclear as a solution to climate change, refusing to sort of run anything else critical of nuclear at all, even engage in a debate. And then you have people like Bill McKibben or George Monbiot, who maybe has, modified his position a little bit. Mainstream sort of climate campaigners, big names who have also taken the bait here. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well, and why you think that is. Is it really just the existential crisis of climate change that people are panicked? Like, how do we get them your book and your arguments, right? To get them educated on this question. So could you say a little bit about why all these people are suddenly together on this as a solution?
That's a great question. There are, obviously very different reasons that are motivating different people, different groups of these people. I'll start with the billionaires first, right? The Bill Gates, Sam Altman types who sort of have been very prominent in this. And I think there are sort of two elements to their argument, if you like, two elements to their motivation. One is they definitely hope to, in some way, profit from this enterprise, right? Many of them are using technology as their answer to anything, right? If you say there's a problem about racism in the country, they'll say, oh yeah, we have a technological solution for that. We just have to put up an app in everybody's phone, something, right? They'll come up with something of that sort, right? I've actually had a conversation with somebody from McKinsey who, during the, one of the big Black Lives Matter things was said, oh, we have an answer. We've been thinking a lot about this in McKinsey. I'm like, are you out of your mind? What do you think you're going to come out in McKinsey that's going to come? But anyway, that's the way they think about it, right? Everything has to have a technological solution, or in the case of McKinsey, it'll be a managerial solution, right? And people like Bill Gates, their strategy essentially seems to be, we're going to put in some money, right? And they have enormous amounts of money, so they can put it in all kinds of things. And so they put, a few tens of millions of dollars or whatever it is. Bill Gates, I think, has put in more right now, at least so he claims. We don't know anything because everything is sort of, nothing is public. Anyway, so they put in a certain amount of money, but immediately after that, they want public money. They don't put all the money that they want, right? What did Bill Gates do? He put in some amount of money. Immediately, he goes to Washington, D.C. and says, this federal government has to give us money. And the federal government did give him money, right? And then he also went to Beijing and hoped to get the Chinese to do it. And that plan didn't work out because of Donald Trump got elected, and he and Xi Jinping had a fallout, and basically then he had to come back to the US, right? But that's one element in their strategy. They put in some money, they want the public to fund other money, and this is kind of the standard way by which there is sort of all the risks are borne by the public, right? The financial risk, the environmental risk is all socialized, while the profits can be privatized. The second thing, I think, element here in terms of this financial thing alone is, I think in some cases, these venture capitalists are putting in money not in the hope of waiting for the 10, 20 years it's going to take to build one of these plants, and actually that's going to generate power and it's going to bring in, generate electricity and bring in profits through that mechanism. They want to put in some money, go a little bit further, and then sell it stocks on the market. And basically the public essentially buys into this, and they've already made their money. So this is the way that venture capitalists anyway operate. And I think there's a lot of money floating around in Silicon Valley, I think, especially after the crash of 2008, which never has found a good home. They're always looking for this new, Facebook, the new, Bitcoin. Now it's all AI, right? But none of that has really panned out in the way that they want, right? And actually, you can understand also why it's never going to pan out, because if you're dealing with a system that's always growing, the amount of funding money that's looking for the 3% returns that David Harvey, for example, talks about is always growing. And there's only so much you can spend the money on. So there's always that money issue there. The last thing which I want to say is, I think for a lot of people, there's also something ideological here, which is they want to maintain the system more or less the way it is. And climate change is a big threat for that. They see everybody's concerned about it. Everybody's telling them you cannot operate the system. We need to have system change, and rather than just fix it. And these people are coming and saying, no, don't worry about system change. We have it all figured out. We just have to have this technology, right? Some people think about it as being renewables, but a lot of people also think about it as being nuclear, partly because nuclear fits very well into the current system, right? The current energy system is based on large fossil fuel plants. And if you look at the actual distribution of nuclear reactors and who owns nuclear reactors in the United States, there's a huge overlap between the utilities that own nuclear plants and that also have large fossil fuel interests, coal or natural gas or both, right? And so they are not interested in changing the system in any fundamental way. Renewables mean that if you expand renewables, you are going to have to change the system, right? And that's a different conversation we can have another time. I don't want to get into that right now, but because of the nature of renewables, it doesn't fit into the current system very well. And that's, I think, one reason why nuclear is attractive to these people. But you see all of these people, in particular, Sam Altman, there's a quote in the book about him saying, if you don't give them as much energy as you want, then people start talking about degrowth and so on and so forth. And that is completely immoral. Right? The fact that he would call something of that sort immoral suggests that he's really scared about it deep down, that actually this idea might get a hold of, people might get persuaded by that. And that's a huge challenge for them, because they have to keep saying, we can keep growing forever, and you can sort of add to that. Now, coming back to the sort of left position, I think, this is a long-standing debate in left circles. How do we deal with the environment, with ecological constraints? Do we pretend that ecological constraints can always be overcome? And because the moment you say that, they'll say, oh, you're just a Malthusian. You don't understand technology and things of that sort. But, Malthus was somebody in his time doing certain kinds of things from certain perspectives, right? We know a lot more about the Earth's system today. We know that some of these constraints are real. And so there is a scientific reality which we have to deal with. And we are also having to deal with the political reality that it's hard to go to the working class, which has already been, subject to so much, what should we say, their real incomes have not risen. They're finding themselves in debt. They can't afford to go to college, all kinds of things, and telling them you need to sort of curb your consumption. That's not going to be a politically viable argument, right? So then you have to kind of pretend. Some people choose to say, okay, we can find this fully automated luxury communism idea, right? Or something of that sort, that, we can find this technological solution very much like the neoliberal capitalists are saying, right? There is a technological solution Only thing is we have to have socialist control over all these technologies. Then everything is going to be all right. I think that is pretending, right? Between the scientific reality, which cannot of climate change and a whole bunch of other ecological constraints, biodiversity loss, etc., and the political reality, I think only one thing can change. That is the politics. The science is not going to change, right? And again, this is a very hard conversation. We have to be having this conversation, but I don't think it helps to pretend that somehow you can sort of escape out of these constraints. I mean, capitalism is a very diverse, a very supple system which can sort of change a lot, but it cannot change certain other things, right? And I think we're also at a stage where it's not just the ecological constraints, but also in terms of where on Earth can we expand? What are the horizons? Where are the limits to sort of future extraction? And we have sort of reached those limits as well, right? China, Africa, all of those places have been now already inside the capitalist market. There are no more markets to sort of go into. And so that's another reason why what worked in the past may not work in the future. But these are, I don't think anybody has a crystal ball that can sort of tell how it's going to play out. But all one can say is that depending on how we act, how we react to these situations, what is going to happen is going to change.
Great. I really appreciate that. I think of your comment here where you say the climate crisis is a crisis of political economy as much as it is an environmental crisis. And I'm going to call the Verso editorial group and ask them to make sure they send a book to the Jacobin group, to Bill McKibben, to the whole lot of them. Thanks for writing it.
Yeah,
Gosh.
yeah. I guess, we could sit here and talk for another hour about, uranium mining, the risks of plants and war zones. But let's just go back to climate change, and maybe we can end there. One of the things that you write about so coherently is really just the timetable of and the reality of rolling out these plants. So just for a second, let's pretend that let's pretend and believe all the propaganda that the pro-nuclear industry throws at us, that they're safe, that they're reliable. But as you touched on the cost a little bit, but what about the timetable for this? I mean, if this is really going to be an answer to climate change, is it going to happen fast enough? Could it possibly happen fast enough?
Simple answer is no, it cannot happen fast enough. And there are, again, physical constraints and there are political constraints on how fast you can build it out, right? The physical constraint is it takes on average around 10 years for a nuclear plant to go from the point where you're pouring concrete into the ground to the point where it is going to start supplying power to the electricity grids around the world, right? But you cannot start doing that right away. So if British Columbia, where I live, doesn't have any nuclear plants right now, but let's say the premier decides tomorrow that we're going to build a nuclear plant, they will have to go get the appropriate environmental clearances, the safety clearances, go through a process by which they select a particular vendor, find a community that is willing to live near this facility, right? There's a lot of resistance in so many places where you propose to build nuclear plants. And last but not least, raise the tens of billions of dollars you need to construct that plant, right? Somebody find the people who are willing to finance those things. That's a long process. It takes so it'll take 15, 20 years before BC can generate any electricity if it decides to do that. And we see this actually in many countries that have done exactly the same thing. Finland, for example, decided, I forget, it was in 2002 or something like that, they passed the legislation that said we're going to build a new nuclear plant. And it took exactly 20 years, give or take, for the reactor to be connected to the grid, right? And so these are in countries which already have nuclear plants, which have had the know-how, which have had a lot of experience. But the climate problem is a global problem. And we need, if indeed nuclear power has to be a part of the solution, it has to expand in the many countries which are growing really fast, the so-called developing countries, right? I use that term sort of guardedly. I know that's a problematic term, but that's the term which the nuclear industry uses, so I'm just using it for the present. But it's the Indonesias and the Nigerias and Egypt and all these other countries that have to be building these nuclear plants in large numbers. And I think those countries, the odds are that the timelines will be even longer, right? As compared to the United States or Finland or some of these places, right? So the timeline, I think, just doesn't work out with the rate of this thing. And I think the practical sort of, or the empirical proof that this is the case is shown in the share of global electricity that is supplied by nuclear power plants, right? The nuclear power plants around the world used to supply 17.5% in the year 1996, right? That was the highest it ever reached. Since then, it has been continuously declining. And the last year's statistics for 2023 it was barely over 9%. Okay, so roughly about half of what it was in the 1990s. Now, if you were to think about nuclear power being a solution to climate change, that share should have actually been increasing, right, consistently at the cost of fossil fuels, right? It's not that people have not, the number of reactors have been more or less the same between the mid-90s and now. The share has been reducing because everybody's building everything else, and those things get built much faster. Those are in recent years, there has been renewables. Renewables have grown from, probably about 1% in the mid-1990s to now 15%. So it's overtaken nuclear, right? So people are doing something about climate change. That energy is going towards for renewables to the extent that you can be positive or hopeful or optimistic about trying to deal with the climate crisis within the political economy constraints that we have. I would put my bet on renewables. Right? If a funder, if a financier were to come and say, should I invest in a solar plant or something like that, I would say you're likely to see the solar plant actually generate power and hopefully sell it, right? You have no such guarantee in the case of nuclear plants, right? So it's a different thing. Of course, whether they make money or not is a political economy question. It depends on whether actually you get the kind of rates of return that you have. But in the nuclear case, a lot of the funding is going towards plants which are never going to be built. There's a very large fraction of plants that have been proposed which have never been built. So in the United States, for example, in the mid-2000s, after the George Bush administration passed the Energy Policy Act, there were plans to build roughly 30 reactors. And they were predicting that by the year 2021, there would be 15 gigawatts of new capacity, 15 large nuclear plants, right? In actual fact, of those 30 reactors, only 4 of the reactor construction projects moved forward. 2 of them were in the state of South Carolina, which got abandoned after the spending about $9 billion. Right? And the other 2 were in the state of Georgia, which just got online now. So you can see roughly it took about 20 years between the time when the incentives were announced and the first nuclear power was started being produced. But the one thing I'll also mention is that in these 2 states were special states. The reason they were special was because of the way electricity is legislated in those states. And the legislatures of those states allowed these utilities to pass on costs to the ratepayers before the nuclear plant was constructed, right? Traditionally, it has been the case that once you build a new facility and it comes online, you can start charging people to sort of recoup the costs. That has been the structure of the electricity industry in the past. In these states, they actually passed legislation that allowed them to pay. And so the people of South Carolina paid, $2 billion plus. We don't know exact amount because it's still under dispute, but a fair amount of money for 2 reactors that never got built, essentially for a big hole in the ground. So that's the kind of special circumstance which allowed even these states to move forward. Now, hopefully not all legislatures are going to allow that kind of cost being passed through, right? And so I don't think we are going to see this grow anytime fast. And so this is why I argue that this is not a feasible way to solve climate change, even if you could, pretend that all of the undesirable elements are not a problem, are not an issue.
Yeah, and you also talk about uranium mining, right? That there are political and economic constraints around that. A lot of the uranium that originally in the past has been mined in Russia, previously the Soviet Union, but now with the sanctions, they're looking elsewhere. So New Mexico, and recently in Australia, indigenous lands that are and people fighting back and stopping these mines from being developed. So there is a lot of there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of pushback at the local level as well. Ramana, thank you so much for joining us and everybody for listening. Ramana is the author of the new book, Nuclear is Not the Solution. We're going to be in Chicago at the Socialism Conference, and I'm very honored to sit on a panel and listen to Ramana for an hour when we're there. Very, very excited to do that. So please, everybody, pick up this book, buy it for your neighbor, go to your library, and please share this podcast with everybody.
Thank you so much, Ramana. It's been great to have you. Yeah, pick up the book, bring it to your local climate change group. Like these are the arguments that we need to be armed with. And I'm so happy to see this in print and looking forward to hearing you speak about it some more.
Thank you, Erik. Thank you, Joshua. It's really my honor to be on this show and to be on the panel with you and the Socialism Conference. And, any of your listeners who are there, I hope that we'll get to see them in person and say hello to them as well.
Thanks again. And we will be back next week with another episode of CounterPunch Radio.